Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Planning Commission podcast. Today's episode, do you want fries with that? With Maggi Adamek, who is our food systems expert.
The Planning Commission podcast is a spirited discussion with myself and a couple of my longtime colleagues in the profession. Our discussions are based solely on our own opinions and do not reflect the opinions or views of our employers, the American Planning Association, or even our alma maters. So grab a seat in the back of City Hall, dig out an old copy of Robert's Rules, and for goodness sakes, read your packet. The Planning Commission is now in session.
All right, everybody, let's take roll call. So Commissioner Smith.
Here.
And Commissioner Kostelik.
Here and full after my lunch.
There you go. Well, we're not going to ask what you had. You might get judged. I'll judge you. You know that.
Today's would definitely be beanie weenies.
You did not.
Yeah, but that's with my amped up baked beans. I don't go straight up on
baked beans. Yeah, okay.
Fair.
All right, so today's agenda is our discussion item, whiskey pairing, our interview, and the lightning round. Can I get a motion to approve?
So moved.
Thank you. I'm sure there's a second in there, right,
Second.
Jess? There you go. Cool.
I always kind of wonder, am I doing that right? Second?
All right,
We
so
need to
to our
review.
audience, to our audience, just a reminder, go to all of our past discussions, go to our website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. You know we're available on YouTube, Amazon, Apple, Spotify, and Deezer. Do us a favor, subscribe, like, and give us your feedback. We love your emails, absolutely. Can't wait to hear more. And as I mentioned, our last episode, I think we have an episode coming up where we're going to tackle some of those questions, maybe even with some of our guests. So can't wait for that. So let's get into this discussion on food system. I had asked my fellow commissioners, what drives you crazy about the food system in the United States of America? Now, that's a very complicated, deep question, and I can't wait for Maggie to share because she's going to discuss, I'm sure, all the different layers of what a system actually looks like. But off the cuff, your first instinct answer is, what do you think? What drives you crazy about the food systems? Do I need to go first or what? You good?
I need to know the following. Why is it that it's so difficult for me to find like just a regular fresh sandwich in a fast situation? Like it is just, if I want a sandwich in the US, I got to go through a fast food drive-through. We are set up a little bit for failure there. So that in a health way, it
hard to
bothers me.
find good things to eat sometimes,
It's
right?
hard to find good things to eat. So
Yeah.
I don't know what that, I mean, I hope that answers your question. That makes me sad. It's
No, that's
frustrating.
perfectly legit. I think a lot of people would share that. So Don, you got one?
Oh, I think it's like the degrees we go to of complexity and processing to produce something that we then want to advertise and label as healthy. You know, and I don't know, maybe I'm totally wrong on like the Beyond Meat stuff. I can certainly understand and appreciate a more plant-based diet, but if I know I have something like quality ground beef or something in there, I'm sorry, I'm going to take that over the 1,000 chemicals that are in some of the other stuff that are kind of advertised as healthier. I'd much rather just have like a veggie burger and know it's a veggie burger for real. So that's the one. And now you got to look because you're at this restaurant or that restaurant, and it might be snuck in there on you. You might not even realize that they're serving you something like that. It's just like, let's just be more straight up and honest.
So I got a quick side note. I went to a place that was no longer in operation here in Boise. It was really good, unfortunately. So I went in one day and I'm like, you know what? I don't want meat. I just want a black bean burger. They had it on their menu. I thought, that sounds good. They brought it out, took a bite. I'm like, dang, this is fantastic. This is really good. And I'm looking at it. I'm going, wait a minute. And then the waiter comes around. I go, is this the black bean burger? He had that look. He goes, oh, and it wasn't. It was a regular patty. And he freaked out because he's like, he knew I could probably.
This is the best black bean burger I've ever eaten.
Settle down. It's all good. I love a good black bean burger, don't get me wrong, but it was just kind of one of those funny moments, but
That's awesome.
so what drives me crazy is like, man, there's so many things about the food system in the United States that drives me crazy. And I'm going to get two just because I can. One is, man, and Don knows this. God, I can't stand drive-thrus. And it's like, we as planners, right? We get criticized for, oh, what, you're social engineering. You're trying. I'm sorry, what? Are you going to tell me that drive-thrus have not socially engineered us as a culture for the last 60, 70 years? Like, come on. I think it's probably a number one. But the other one that drives me nuts is having worked with so many schools and seeing the stuff that kids have to eat sometimes. And I know in many cases, and I'm sure Maggie can shed light on this later too, is if a school wants to go out and grow corn or lettuce or tomatoes or whatever on the property that never gets used hardly, right? They can't even eat it because there's a contract in place with the food vendor that they can't even necessarily violate, because that they see that as a violation, as being a competition. And you're kind of going, gosh, this is so sad. We have perfectly viable space to grow good produce for these kids. And in some cases, because of our own laws, they can't even eat it, And so, man, it drives me crazy. So
we want to make the healthy choice the easy choice. However,
yeah, right.
Yeah,
right,
that's what I'm saying. It's really hard to make a healthy choice that's easy, and I just
garden flavored
that to be better.
corn chips, right? So, all right.
Who doesn't love a sun chip? Let's be honest. A sun chip, ooh, that is a good snack. But anyway, keep going.
I think I still have some biodegradable sun chip bags that still haven't biodegraded 10 years later.
All right, so let's move on. Don, whiskey pairing, what do we have for? Do you want fries with that?
I'm going a little different this week. I'm going to go with a cocktail pairing from the country's preeminent cocktail bar and producer, Death and Company. Fabulous book. Loved it when we were in Denver last month. And the cocktail I'm going with, because of food and the importance of bees, is called the Bee's Knees. Figure it's light and refreshing. It's springtime. Bee's Knees. So here, get your pencils out. 2 ounces of Tanqueray London dry gin. Try any gin you want. 3/4 ounces of lemon juice. 3/4 ounces of honey syrup. 3 drops of Scrappy's lavender bitters, and garnish with a brandied cherry. And the reason I bring that up, we know that healthy bee populations lead to greater food yields, better biodiversity, and all those things. It's kind of the cornerstone of our food system. So I think that might be our first cocktail pairing in the run of shows.
And one of my favorites. If you make your own simple syrup, extra points.
That's one of the better pairings I think you've come up with, K-Man. I like that. I think that's a good one, man. I like that.
It wasn't the Dickel White on the zoning side. No, that one's
clever, but really
clever. Yeah. All right. So with that, first, real quick, we want to thank our partners at Plant Edison. Such a special relationship we have with them, and we certainly appreciate their support. So to our audience, we're going to take a quick moment and thank our friends at Plant Edison for supporting today's podcast. If you are looking to sharpen your urban planning skills and advance your planning career, head to Plant Edison and their courses. They offer over 300 courses on cutting-edge planning topics and skills, such as parking reform, missing middle housing, equity analysis, and climate resilience. So go visit courses.plantedison.com/PC10 to take advantage of an exclusive offer for Planning Commission podcast listeners. That's right. You get a discount just for listening to us. There you go. So thanks to Plant Edison. Okay, let's go on to our interview. Without a doubt, our star of today's episode, Maggi Adamek. She is the CEO. That's right, CEO. That's a title I don't even have, and I own my own dang business. What's up with that? CEO of Terra Soma. Maggi, thanks for joining the Planning Commission podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much to Chris and the other commissioners for including me today. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Almost as much as us. Thank you for joining us. I know you're crazy busy, and this is a subject that, as I mentioned, we haven't broached much at all, and it's critically important for a number of reasons. So let's just start off, Maggi. Tell us about you. Tell us about how you got to this place, your general background, education, knowledge, and just everything about Maggi.
Well, I'll start with the things that make sense, and then I'll show sense, and then they converge, right? So I'm the daughter of a farm kid. I was born and raised in the Twin Cities here in Minnesota, or what I like to call the sacred umbilicus of North America. We have waters of the Mississippi, and we have the largest freshwater lake in North America, one of the largest lakes in the world. So represent. I was going to say my cocktail of choice this month is the Aviator. We are celebrating Princess Passing, the 7th year.
That's right.
It's near and dear to our collective hearts here in Minneapolis, and the Aviator is something I enjoy every year in tribute to him because it is a colored cocktail. So my dad was a farm kid and my mother was a city girl. So my dad's father was a Bohemian Catholic and had 13 brothers and sisters, which meant my dad had a really large extended family, almost 70 first cousins. My mother and father were both school teachers, which meant we had the summers off. And so I spent those summers on my grandparents' farm. And my dad's older and younger brother were both farmers just a few miles down the road from my grandfather's farm. One was a turkey farmer and grew a lot of those Thanksgiving turkeys that people enjoyed. And my other uncle was a dairy farmer and a member of the board for Land O'Lakes. So I spent all my summers on the farm quite literally. And because my father had such a large extended family, all the weddings and funerals that we went to were chock full of farmers everywhere you looked. So I have that rural heritage. And my mother was a city girl, and she and my grandmother taught me how to cook and bake and can. So those food skills that are a traditional part of many women's upbringing in my particular generation was something that I was fortunate to have passed down from my mother and grandmother, although my mother made sure both my brother and I knew how to cook and can and bake. So he too benefited from those teachings. I was lucky enough I was too little to lay irrigation pipes, so my brother got tapped. And I got to do stuff like shell peas and bake bread and the fun stuff. So my family heritage meant that I knew where food came from and I understood what family farms were. And I also knew by virtue of those experiences what rural communities were like and what rural culture was like. So even though I grew up in a metropolitan area, that was something that was very close and familiar to me. Then I went to college and I majored in African-American studies. What, you ask, does food systems have to do with majoring in African-American studies, particularly with an emphasis in literature? And there were a lot of things I loved about studying American identity through the lens of the Black experience. One of the things that I really learned was to think in systems across time and space, right? Because when you think about people who are scattered across the globe for a variety of reasons through time and space, there's ways you learn to build patterns and associations. And so teaching how to think in diaspora was super helpful for the kind of lens of analysis you need to bring to food systems planning. But the other important piece that I learned was really about how social movements work. Right? You study the civil rights movement, you study the role of African Americans in the labor movement, you study the anti-slavery movement. So you study these big chapters of social movements in the United States and learn about organizing and what it takes at a community scale, what it takes to change policy at a federal scale, and how you get people involved to essentially change systems to chart their own destiny. And so that was enormously helpful for me in understanding how communities can go about effectively making change and making the changes that they want to see. So that's kind of boomerang number one, particularly I'm European American, I'm not African American. So that was sort of boomerang one. And then my PhD is actually in curriculum and instruction. And so what I was really interested in, because both my parents were teachers, is learning. And I wanted to know that the role learning played when people are coming together to try to make change. How do people learn? What is it that they need to know to skillfully advocate for change, to identify the changes that they want to make, to use good collaborative decision-making mechanisms to decide that agenda together? And how can we take what we know about the way that adults learn to galvanize their change efforts, like shorten the pathway to impact, deepen the extent of the impact, and minimize infighting and some of the other obstacles that arise when groups of people are trying to make positive change together for their community or their society. So that's a little bit of my, childhood and formal training. And then the final chapter, I spent about 20 years at the University of Minnesota working on sustainable food systems efforts at the community and regional and even national scales. So that's where I really cut my teeth, if you will, on how you work across scales and within different types of systems to affect changes, whether it's about access to healthy food, it's about the agricultural infrastructure and the type of agricultural production system we want as a society, whether it's for environmental or health or economic reasons, the role that policymaking plays at these different scales, and how people have a say in our food systems and the values that guide our food systems. So I did that for about 20 years, and people kept asking me to help them. So I quit my job and started helping people full time. So different perch, but similar work. And I've been doing that ever since.
Maggie, this is so cool. What just resonated with me when you were telling your story is my grandfather, he majored in agricultural business. I think that's right. And he's been gone a while, but he was the coolest. He had a huge, what we would call a kitchen garden in the South. And I grew up in rural North Carolina, and we would go down there and, and pick stuff when it was ready. And I remember all his stories were over us stringing beans, yep, right, to get them ready to can. And so I was living my little kid life. I was never big enough to lay the pipe down either. I had to string beans with Grandpa, which was awesome. So.
Well, and a lot of us learn our lessons about food from our elders, right? Whether it's our grandparents or other loved ones, that's where the major lessons about food, where it comes from, what it's for, what we value. Oftentimes that's been transmitted through our families. So that's a really common experience for many, just like you and me.
Yeah. And to this day, I can't it hurts my heart to let food go bad, like produce. I freeze things, I cook it, I blanch it, I can't, whatever, which is really silly for me to do that. I should just buy less food. But anyway,
she's not wrong. I once was her house and ate a half-eaten hot dog out of the freezer. So I mean, right?
I love hot dogs. Okay. Well, anyway, so I'm thinking about Papa Henry, and that's just really cool. And I'm thinking about stringing beans and stuff. But I am also thinking about our listeners, and I think food systems planning is one of those niche areas that folks don't really know what that is. I'll be honest. I was like, we're going to talk about food systems planning. Which part of that are we going to talk about? So, like, what is food systems planning, Maggie? And then why should your city planners care, or even your rural and regional planners, like urban, rural, regional, remote? Why should we care?
Yeah. So I'll first of all, define what a food system is, right? Yeah. And then start with, what does this term food systems planning mean? Because it actually means different things to different people. And then, we can kind of wrap up with the interface between the type of food systems planning professionals, regardless of sort of what geography they're working in. So many people are really familiar with the term food supply. And when we think of food supply, we think of the food we have access to that gets made or grown somewhere and moves around and ends up on our plates or our bowls or our hands, if it's a piece of pizza. And then ultimately, as you were suggesting, into the waste stream at some point. And the idea of a food system isn't all that different. Essentially, it's every action that's related from the time the food is grown, caught, foraged, to the time it ends up in our waste stream. And so I call that grow or raise, process, distribute, get. Some people get their food at a restaurant. Some people get their food at a drive-thru. Many people get their food at a grocery store. Lots of people get their food at convenience stores. Many people get their food from a hunger relief agency. Kids get their food at school. People at work might get their food at work from a vending machine or from a cafeteria. If you're in the hospital, you get your meal brought to you as a patient. So the get covers a lot of different features. And then there's the dispose. What happens to what's left? Are there food scraps like the onion skins from the onion you chopped, or that other half of a hot dog that you couldn't you put it in the freezer. So there's all these steps along the way of our food system, but there's other dynamics at play that are part of the system too, right? It's not a linear continuum from grow to dispose. It also is the policy at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, global trade policies that dictate how many avocados we can buy from Mexico, where we're going to get our coffee, sugar tariffs, and the Caribbean. There's all these international trade agreements. So policy happens at every scale, from raw agricultural commodities and things like the equipment and the irrigation and the chemical inputs, all of those things that are around the activity of growing food, all the way to the manufacturing and distribution of our food. So economics plays a key role in that as well. So it's not just the steps along the way from the farm to the table to the waste stream. It's also the other systems and processes along the way that are a part of that system. So that's what a food system is. I'm going to pause there before I start talking about food systems planning. Any questions?
No, I think that's a great point and a good segue into the next discussion. I just think on the planning side, I remember a story a few years ago of just at the planning level that we discuss, of even like San Diego's community gardens ordinance taking 5 years to get through the process. So I tangle that with what you said about global trade and other policies, and we get into something pretty hairy. So yeah, talk about that planning side of it.
Right. So a number of years ago, the people who first, there was a lot of activism in various pockets of the food system for a long time that was really values driven. And essentially after World War II, which is after my dad left the farm. I mean, my dad grew up without electricity and running water. They didn't even have a tractor. They were too poor. So they used draft horses. So talk about time travel. And in this sort of 60-year time frame from when he left the farm to now, we've seen changes in many people. 1% or less of our population now in the United States are farmers, right? When my dad was a kid, the majority of Americans were living in rural areas on farms. So we've had this huge in-migration to the city. More people were food self-sufficient at that time. And after World War II, we started to say, how can we make our food system more efficient and productive? So people like my father, who grew up in deep poverty, could leave the farm, get an education, and sort of climb the class ladder. And what that meant is you needed to mechanize agriculture, and you needed less manual labor. And then there were also an awful lot of chemicals that were generated as part of the war effort during World War II, and they needed something to do now that they didn't need those chemicals for the war effort. And so they started to look at this idea of productivity, yield, and efficiency, and think about the ways in which they could harness some of the chemical engineering knowledge that we had to use as agricultural inputs to grow more robust crops, have greater yields, farmers could make more money. So it was this project that was really about productivity, efficiency, yield, and even leisure. How do we free up people's time from the drudgery and heavy manual labor of growing and preparing food? Because it truly was a massive undertaking. I remember my son looking at a picture of his great-grandfather, who was a farmer, no tractor. And he was like, Mom, Grandpa was jacked. And I was like, he was doing hard manual labor all day, every day, all year round. So yeah, he was jacked. There was a reason for that. So what that paradigm shift created a food system that gave birth to microwavable meals. Women things like microwaves, things like mixers, things like electric can openers. Remember, the knives you plug in to carve your Thanksgiving turkey? It's even too much work to carve your own turkey. You got to develop a machine for that. So between the mechanization of agriculture and the intensification, and then the commitment to convenience on the food preparation side, our food system began to look really different. So the food system of my father's formative years is very different than the food system I grew up with, where we still cooked primarily from scratch. We canned, et cetera. My mom wouldn't let us have a microwave. She wouldn't buy prepared foods, but most of my friends had that, right? And very few of my friends' mothers were still canning and doing that kind of thing. Along comes a new movement in the US that said, we see all these family farms disappearing. Agriculture is being concentrated. Now it's owned by large corporations. The family farm is going away. And you might remember the farm crisis of the 80s, where a lot of people lost their farms and the economies of rural communities just collapsed. And so you had a lot of activism to try to figure out how to save and support that family farm, but the scale of agriculture that they grew for, which was local and regional customers, began to disappear, and more of us looked toward a General Mills, or more of us looked towards some of these national companies to be the entities that fed us rather than our local farmers. And ag policy from the Nixon administration moved farmers away from diversified production of things that people would eat to growing things like corn and soybeans that were used for biofuels and feeding livestock. So farmers were no longer in the business of growing food. They were in the business of growing feed and fuel for global markets. So the nature of agricultural policy really changed, which led to that farm crisis and the collapse of that sort of ag in the middle. You know how you're talking about housing in the middle? So there was all of this activism in that regard. And then along comes the obesity epidemic. It was sort of like our food system really ran amok to the point where kids were able to get large serving sizes of soda pop, a glut, chicken nuggets everywhere. You would really have to hunt to be able to get a healthy option outside of your own home. And it got to the point where the obesity crisis and the related dietary diseases, that sort of proliferation and expansion of those rates around the US, people got really concerned. And that's when the medical and public health field stepped up and got involved in the food system. Once they got involved, they said, we've got to come up with some strategies to change what people are eating, but we need to do that at a systems level than just teaching people how to make a salad. That's going to take forever. We've already tried that. It doesn't work. We need to start changing systems. We need to start changing environments. We need to start changing policies in the places where people spend time. Once they started that process, that's when the planning field got involved. The planning field started to say, we're busy planning our roads. We're busy planning our bike paths. We're busy planning our crosswalks. We're busy creating these developments. We're thinking about the flow of water, whether you're, drain tile, if you're in rural areas or what have you, but we're not really thinking about how people get their food and how healthy it is. And the planning community as a whole really kind of felt a call to action around embedding thinking about access and healthy eating as core components to community design, whether it's the built environment or saying we're developing this new area of town. How are people going to have access to a grocery store? How as a community are we going to support our farmers markets? How do we plan for and zone for community gardening space? How do we support the kinds of positive activity that improve people's access, reliable access, easy access to affordable, healthy food? So that's how
I want to make sure I understood, because I think you made a great analogy, but I want to make sure it's clear for the listeners on analogous to the missing middle on the housing side. So you're explaining that obviously at this big, kind of factory farm scale is certainly one end of that. And on the lower end is still just like our personal gardening. Or if that's correct, then define the middle a little bit better.
So ag, and this is a term that's used in sort of agriculture. The idea of agriculture in the middle is that these are typically family-owned agricultural enterprises, your classic family farm that's growing raising one or more products for a smaller scale market. That could be a community down the road. It could be a dairy producer that has, 50 cows and is producing that milk for a creamery that, provides milk and milk related products for a region of a state or across a few states. So that ag in the middle is really about growing products for some individual eaters, but really at a population scale. But that population scale is geographically more limited in scope, right? It could be nearby, or it could be a little farther away, but it's not the United States and it's not, the global market. And it was the diversified family farms, that ag in the middle, that provided those kind of foods. And what we ended up with on the other side of the farm crisis was the hyper-local niche that have never fully gone away, and a lot of people love and support, and then our global food system. And we missed a lot in the middle. So that is what on the ag side, we've really been trying to repair that, because much of those farmers help drive thriving rural economies. And those farmers were the ones that were growing food for local and regional markets. So when we talk about planning professionals and the role that they can play at the city level, they're asking questions about how do we facilitate people's ability to grow food for themselves and others that they care to give it to, sell it to, prepare it for. And then how are we thinking about our local food culture and local food economy? What other infrastructure like farmers markets, community gardens, urban ag production are we layering into our plans? So that's on the production side, but they're also asking questions about how easy is it for someone who's low income to get on a bus or walk to their local food pantry to get food? How easy is it for, where did we locate our farmers market? And can people who work second shift get to the farmers market on a bus or walk there? Is there a full service grocery store within walking distance of, a neighborhood, or all they have to rely on if they're hungry and don't have a vehicle is a convenience store that is selling energy drinks and chips? So really thinking a lot about people's access to food, the type of food that people have access to, and what local units of government, and whether it's comp plans or, economic development activity, can promote a thriving and healthy local food culture that can facilitate food access, can support the development of food skills, and help these smaller growers and makers, food makers, with support for developing their enterprises and helping create their market channels, because then they become a part of the economic backbone of that community.
You ever talk with someone who's so intelligent you just feel like I gotta go read a book right now? Like I gotta go read some books, man.
Read the books. You don't have to go read the books.
Making me regret that beanie weenie choice for lunch.
Yeah.
Well, I gotta ask a question here. All right, so as I've shared with our audience, I'm a big fan of being in the gym and love, kind of pushing weight around. It's just one of my favorite things to do. And it's a major part of the discussion in that environment is how much of it is weight training, how much of it is nutrition. And a lot of people in that world will tell you, if they're being honest, it's about 80, even upwards of 90% nutrition. And so my question is, it's so interesting to hear you describe the planning profession in the last few decades in particular, really working hard on that energy balance of in versus out, and obesity and diabetes and that whole discussion, right? And so that sort of age-old adage about the amount of calories you take in versus the amount of calories you take out, right? And this mathematical relationship and what that might mean if they're imbalanced. But I would guess you have an opinion that maybe I'm wrong here, but it's not necessarily that simple. And because of the way that food production has gone down in this country, particularly over the last 50 years, that there are other elements specifically about how we are making food and selling food and distributing food that add to that discussion about our health, our mobility, our just general well-being. So I'm going to tee you up for that and see what you have to say, because I have got a few. I thought you probably have lots to say about it.
Yeah, maybe I'll start by answering as a parent, so my sons are now adults, and they're 8 years apart. And when I was a little girl, we moved overseas for a while. And I remember I was 5 and walking down the airplane to my seat, and it was just a haze of smoke. And I was short, so all the smoke was above my head. But, you get these pounding headaches and all the secondhand smoke. And by the time my younger son was 5, they had a smoking room in the airport, couldn't smoke on the planes. And by the time he was in junior high, you had to smoke outside, by a concrete bunker. And by the time he graduated from high school, you can't smoke anywhere at the airport at all, right? So I see this similar trajectory of changes around food over my lifetime. And I think that our understanding of obesity is complex. So first of all, the goal, I say, and Chris, you've heard me say this, you heard me say it last week, I tell communities, if you don't design your community's food environment, it gets designed for you. And not willfully, because people go into things like the planning field because they're really passionate and committed to building community, and they want to be a part of helping design community to benefit people. But food systems hasn't really been a focus of the planning profession, so people just aren't trained to think about it in certain ways, right? And so they may be thinking about, we better have a grocery store over here, or yep, the dollar store is applied, we're going to put it in here, or we're creating this new strip mall and we have room for 4 restaurants and they're all fast food. And, so they sort of make space for food sources, but haven't thought in any detail about the kind of nutritional composition of what goes in there and what people have access to. So part of our role in planning is to design the food environment for a community. And there are best practices and things we know that help. So certainly, one of the things I always look at when I'm working with communities is you can get data on fruit and vegetable consumption in a given community across different demographics. So I'm thinking about rural North Carolina, right? And there was one community I was working in there where the adults in that community average less than 1 serving of fresh fruits and vegetables per day. Wow. And fresh fruit and vegetable consumption is a key indicator or predictor of the acquisition of diet-related chronic disease. See, if people across the entire community aren't really eating fresh fruits and vegetables very much, and people are saying, well, I ate corn, and I'm like, well, corn's a grain, not a vegetable. So a lot of folks that are even saying they ate 1 serving might be saying, I ate corn, or I ate French fries, and French fries is a vegetable, right? Well, yes, and it's not the healthiest vegetable, as we know. So those kind of indicators are really helpful when you're thinking about things as a planner, because you say, how do we inhibit access to unhealthy options and promote access to healthy options that are reliable and affordable? Because many people in our community are facing real challenges in the cost of housing and the cost of food. So one of the things we want to think about is not just that we've thought through where are the sources of food for the community, but what types of food and beverages are available in the places that people are spending time, whether they're trying to get to a grocery store, they're at school, they're at work, or what have you. So yes, improving access to things like fruits and vegetables is an easy first step for a community to take on. Like, okay, if we can up that consumption, there's a lot of other healthy behaviors that come along with people eating more than 1 serving of fresh fruits and vegetables a day. And of course, our federal government says we should have 4 to 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. So people are eating 20% or less in that community in North Carolina. And what we find typically is people eat 3 or less servings per day, regardless of what community you're living in. So part of a planner's job is to think about, okay, well, if we know this is a big an important way to reduce the prevalence of diet-related chronic disease, let's make sure there are farmers markets. Let's make sure there are farm stands. Let's make sure that every convenience store offers perishable, healthy items. Let's make sure any dollar stores or small footprint grocers we have in our community are required by ordinance to have 500 square feet of their store footprint offer perishable, healthy items. So people aren't just going in and buying shelf-stable, highly processed, highly caloric foods that end up creating, health problems for people. I think another consideration that's really important is there are other factors at play in obesity, right? Like endocrine disruptors. And so when we're thinking about things like air quality or exposure to various types of chemicals, including agricultural chemicals, sometimes there's actually environmental interventions that would be helpful to address those obesity rates in complement to some of these, the solutions that we can embed that really think about how we promote and increase people's access to healthy food. And I think, when we talk about the healthy choice being the easy choice, that's really the aim with these kinds of planning strategies when it comes to food is kind of twofold. One, how do we make it easy to get healthy, affordable food? And 2, how do we promote a lively and vibrant local food culture that's grounded in healthy habits? I remember I was working in West Virginia and I asked a community, I was like, what's your food? Like, what's your signature food? And they said pepperoni balls. I was like, pepperoni balls? What's a pepperoni ball? And it's a glob of dough with a handful of pepperoni in the middle and a bunch of cheese. And then you make it into a huge ball and you drop it in a deep fryer. So like the only thing missing is that you didn't glaze it in sugar. Like that would have been.
Oh, I'm sure there's a dipping sauce involved there somehow.
Exactly. So the other thing that planners can do is think about food identity in a community. And that can be about their agricultural identity, or it can be about their farmers markets, or it can be about their local restaurants. And there's some communities like Wenatchee, Washington. It's an agricultural community. It's surrounded by agriculture. And about 35 years ago, they were at this point where they were looking ahead with their development and their planning. And they said, our identity in this community is food. let's build our entire long-term planning and economic development strategy around that. And they've become, it's just wonderful. Their food identity is fantastic. They attract all sorts of tourists to come and enjoy it, but they did it for themselves. And it's ended up producing this really lively, wonderful culture, which leads people to make healthier options, because everywhere they look, what they see is healthy things that are about who they are, right?
So that's kind of what I was thinking about a little bit, diving a little deeper about food systems planning, and you're talking a lot about like, let's have healthy choices, let's help people not have these, these preventable diseases that are diet based and things. And like, I mean, I know why I want to be healthy, but why as a planner should I care about other people in my community being able to be healthy with these healthy choices?
Well, healthcare costs for one thing, and you're going to have to figure out how to get people with things like amputations from diabetes around in the community. If you have an aging population that's large, and a lot of them are low income and facing diet-related chronic diseases, you have outsized needs that your social services sector is going to have to be responsive to. And if you want your kids to stick around in that community and be future leaders and future contributors to the economy, you need them to be healthy. And that's not just their physical health, it's also their mental health. We know that diet plays a really significant role in well-being too, which is why school districts play such a unique and important role in feeding our community's kids. So this is really about investing in health across the lifespan of your community members, and that yields economic benefits. It yields health benefits for the community. It is an important part of a community's cultural identity. And I can tell you, like, if you ever ask a group of people to share a food memory, that comes to mind, they will always share something special, that it's about a family dish, or I was in a foreign country, or someone invited me over to dinner, or we were at this festival. No one ever says my favorite memories are being surrounded by fast food restaurants and guzzling big gulps full of soda pop. Like, no one, every community I talk to, they're pretty clear on the kind of food system they want. They're very clear on it. They know what they want and they know what they don't want, and they know what they wish they had access to and they don't. And the planning profession has a big role to play in helping make that happen for communities.
The last one here, and we get into the lightning round after that. I mean, now we're facing other challenges. And I remember back when COVID first hit, here we discovered that we have two completely separated food distribution networks to grocery stores and to restaurants, and everybody was getting food at grocery stores and not at restaurants. So if we take things like COVID and we take things like climate change, what's next? What do we have to be considering?
Well, for planners, I would say pay attention to the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact. Hundreds of cities globally of all sizes, from small towns to like Mumbai, India, have signed on to this pact, which essentially commits as a municipality to developing a climate change responsive food system. And so I live in Minneapolis. We're just completing ours here. I've had the pleasure and privilege of facilitating that for the city's Food Policy Council. And essentially those priorities are about creating a resilient food system at a municipal scale that's responsive to the realities of climate change and also works to mitigate. Agriculture is a energy intensive undertaking, which actually is one of the main contributors to climate change. So that's a way that cities can get involved in, and there's a ton of US cities doing that of all sizes. So that's something to keep in mind with respect to climate change. What COVID really revealed about our food supply is that it's fracture critical. And what that means is if a pork processor in South Dakota, which contributes 20% pork supply, has a COVID breakout, 200 employees are sick and not at work, we lose access to 20% of the meat that people want to eat in our society overnight. We also learned that when supply chain shortages happen through other parts of the world or bottlenecks, there are empty grocery shelves, there are empty food pantries, et cetera. And so what COVID revealed to us is that we rely too much on one scale of our food supply. We need to differentiate. We need to have replication across scales. So if something doesn't work, we've got other options to lean into. And that's not just, does everybody have a backyard garden? Like, we need more food than that. And so I'm delighted to see both states and our federal government, the USDA right now, really recognizing that and beginning to make investments in planning and development of locally and regionally scaled food systems or locally and regionally scaled food supply, so that we're building in these redundancies and we don't encounter some of those supply chain bottlenecks or, the collapse of some of major sources of our food supply. So I feel optimistic, like that's sort of a silver lining of what happened during COVID, is we're now recognizing the importance of these different scales and that it does require federal investment to be able to help these locales and regions develop the infrastructure that we need.
And it sounds like it gets back to the missing middle piece of that we discussed earlier. I just keep thinking, and Chris, I know when we think about the common chapters in a comprehensive plan, where's one out there that's just food, right?
Yeah.
And looking at that.
Well, they do have them. And, one of the tools that I developed is called the Minnesota Food Access Planning Guide. It's a public document. It was commissioned by the Center for Prevention at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota in a partnership with the Minnesota Department of Health and Extension, our extension service. And that guide provides language across a lot of different food systems related topics that planners can drop into comp and general plans. So when it's time to make that update, what happened in Minnesota is we developed that resource. And every single municipality and county government in the 7-county metro area by state statute had to update their plan. Everybody put in food related content. So many of those chapters got included. And in fact, rural Minnesota said, hey, don't forget us. Tribal nations said, hey, don't forget us. And they began to add some of that language in there too. So there's a lot of good resources out there if planners are interested in thinking about where and how can we address food in our comp plans. And I want to give a shout out to the American Planning Association. They have produced excellent resources on food systems planning, whether it's webinars or toolkits or guides or, scholarly articles or the like. There's a lot of really good material there. And they, from the nation's leading experts, it's just excellent.
And I would say a shout out to those foundations. I know we did some work a few years ago in Minnesota and Blue Cross Blue Shield Foundation. The things they were funding, especially in the built environment side of things, is impressive. So just another feather in their cap.
Yeah, we rock it up in the north.
And you're home with Chuck Marone. If you don't know that name, Strong Towns. If you don't know that name, you should know Chuck Marone. We can introduce it to you, but you probably do. Man, I've been saying something that I think you're saying too for like the last 15 years in the planning world is we're really good at planning and growing. I call it growing houses, but we suck at growing food. Like we're not very good in the urban setting or suburban setting at figuring out how to maintain that part of things. But we know how to grow houses, man. Like we're all over that. But so Maggie, thank you so much for sharing with us. Oh my gosh, so many things to think about, and just the tip of the iceberg. I'm positive of that. This is a complicated discussion and it's multiple layers. So thank you for sharing that part of it. But we're going to move forward into our lightning round, our nonsensical, silly questions that we're going to pepper you with and see how you do in the hot seat here. So I'm going to ask you a couple questions and we'll bounce around here. The first thing you mentioned, you're going to have to commit, Maggie. You got to commit. Favorite Prince song of all time.
Delirious.
What did you say?
Delirious.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, how do you not like that, right?
Noise and delirious. That's like when I get a text, that's the noise that it makes.
Oh, perfect. Prince, I mean, gosh, man. And it's like, did we celebrate him enough while he was alive? I mean, I don't know.
Dress, and I had a purple car until last fall. So like we go hard here in the North Country for Prince for sure.
Okay, perfect. So my other question is, what was your least favorite farm chore?
Yeah. Do I have to pick? It usually relates to manure, as you can imagine. So there's this term that I learned when I was working on the St. Paul campus, which they used to call the ag campus. We don't do that anymore, but manure management was one of the big challenges that the deans of ag always had to deal with all those livestock. So anything mucking stalls, moving manure around, that was never very fun.
funny. I want to know, what is your favorite canned vegetable to eat?
Yeah. There's two that come to mind. White asparagus. I like to make a soup out of white asparagus. And then the other one I would say is marinated artichoke hearts.
Oh my gosh, that was some bougie canning there. I was sitting here going, I remember canned tomatoes. We would can tomatoes whole, and my mom would eat them on white rice. She would just pour it on white rice.
Well, my mom used to we would can tomatoes too, and they were whole. And then she would heat them up, and I'd say, "What's for dinner?" And she would say stewed tomatoes, which was simply heated up tomato. It's like, ugh. So I
know. It's not a favorite to eat, but I do have happy memories of watching my mom eat it on rice. She liked it. I don't know.
Like, just make spaghetti sauce out of it, and I'll
call it good.
What's the largest walleye you've ever caught?
You know, I have never caught a walleye. I will confess, I was an angler, so I caught a lot of crappies, but I did catch a pretty monster largemouth bass. My husband is the fisherman in the family. He used to be a salmon fisherman on the West Coast. So I am more of the lay in the boat and soak up the sun. And, getting the fish off the hook was always a little bit dodgy for me.
I never liked baiting it. I was like, the worms are wiggling around. No, thanks.
I just know from fishing in Minnesota where both the walleye and the pike have teeth, you got to have some of like those knife gloves on your hands to keep
no joke. And those northerns with all their teeth and their bones. Yeah, for sure.
So you have a PhD in education, I think it is, or along those lines. I got to ask you, who was your favorite teacher growing up and why?
Many, but I think I'll pick my beloved college advisor, Dr. Rudolph Bird.
Oh.
He was a mentor and guide. I was fortunate to go to a college that said that the advising relationship was as important as the instruction you received in the classroom. So you develop these lifelong friendships with your professors. And Dr. Bird was elegant and erudite and knew everything about African-American literature and was so dignified and wore the best suits and made me call him Dr. Bird. And he called me Margaret, not Maggie. And when I graduated, he said, well, Margaret, you can now call me Rudolph because we were colleagues. And I couldn't do it because I had and worshiped him. So he really taught me about discernment and taught me about the importance of intellectual cultivation and rigor and committing to study of something over a long period of time, because that long-term commitment is what leads you to mastery and expertise. So I would say him. I had a lot of wonderful teachers along the way, and they were always over at my house because they were all friends with my parents. So in the classroom.
No pressure. Jeez.
So it was hard to get in trouble because I was always surrounded by my teachers.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, what do you eat on your hot dog?
I haven't had a hot dog, but I will tell you this: my husband is half German, and so they eat Wurst, sausages without a bun, and so he has taught me the joy of the sweet Bavarian mustard. That's grainy, that he really likes. I quite like that mustard. It's good.
I love mustard on most things.
It's good for you. I do. Yeah.
I was going to ask you one more food question because it's just fun that way. But what's a food that you've never eaten that would surprise the heck out of people?
A food that I've never eaten. Oh, I have a good one. Like Oscar Mayer bologna. Bologna sandwiches. I mean, just given that era I grew up in, I always thought it looked like skin, so I didn't want to eat it.
It does.
I had a bologna sandwich.
Well, where Jess and I grew up, it's a fried bologna on a biscuit. So that's your breakfast of choice.
Oh, wait a minute. Don and I were driving. I don't remember what town it was in Western North Carolina, but I do recall seeing, I think I have a picture somewhere of the Hardee's, right? That had the Velveeta bologna breakfast biscuit. Yeah.
Yes. That was in Forest City, North Carolina.
Forest City.
You can probably still find that same batch of Velveeta cheese being cut away from.
Listen, Maggie, you were talking about how when you ask people about, their favorite food memory or something, boy, do I have a fried bologna sandwich food memory. There was this restaurant where I lived in Florida, and they made a fried bologna sandwich. The bologna was this thick. You could not mistake that for anything else. Just a big old thick slab. Oh, it was so good. It was so good. It came with a side of potato salad. It was very Southern, but anyway.
I'm speechless.
So good. We'll make this happen for you at some point in your life.
That's a bologna steak.
That is a bologna steak. It's true.
Yeah. The world of food. My favorite is Spam that has the ingredients, and not my favorite isn't eating it, but it has the best ingredient. If you ever read a side of one, every listener, next time you're in the grocery store, go look at a side of Spam. It says literally mechanically separated chicken. The only thing I've ever seen in all the grocery stores that says that. I don't even want to know what the heck that means, and we're just gonna let that go.
Well, I could find out for you because, here in Minnesota, Spam is a local food. So we raise the hogs here in Minnesota and process them, and it gets made into Spam. So Spam is actually made in southern Minnesota, and we have the Spam Museum.
Oh, that's right.
Yes.
It was closed when I came through there during COVID. I was stopping in Austin just for that, and it was like Wally World is closed.
Sometimes I work in Hawaii, and they eat quite a bit of Spam. Oh. And so I was happy to tell them that I said, we eat your macadamia nuts and you eat our Spam.
Yeah,
that's a fair trade.
There you go. All right. Well, Maggie, thank you so much for joining the Planning Commission podcast. I think we're going to put a pause on this episode. We appreciate your time. Your knowledge on this incredibly important discussion and subject. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Look forward to hearing more. And I appreciate the invitation and am appreciative of all the planners out there who are interested in or undertaking food planning work. It's so important and communities really benefit from it. So thanks for your interest.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, there you go. Do you want a side of fries with that? Yep, that's our episode. So commissioners, I need a motion to adjourn.
Don't move.
Only if it's with the side of bologna.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you, our listeners. Remember to hit up our website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. Subscribe and like. And until next time, have a good rest of your week. Thanks. Hey, everybody. Commissioner Danley here. Would you like to see more? Hear more? Well, we got you covered. Go to our website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. It's got everything you want. Guests, yep, past episodes, video, the audio, even our whiskey pairing, links to everything about all the people we've had on, books, websites, you name it. It's unbelievable. You want to reach out to us? Please. We'd be more than happy to chat. You can email us, planningcommissionpodcast@gmail.com. You want to tweet at us? Go for it, @planningcommish. We're also on YouTube with the Planning Commission Podcast channel, Facebook. Heck, send us a carrier pigeon if you need to. We'd love to hear from you about ideas, guests, you name it. Thank you for listening. We appreciate it. We'll keep doing our thing. You keep doing yours. Have a good one.